My name is Riley Emerson. I was born into a family where reputation weighed more than love, and appearances mattered more than truth. My father, Daniel Emerson, was the kind of man people applauded at town halls and PTA meetings. The revered principal of our local high school, the voice of reason in the community, the man who spoke about values, integrity, and discipline while quietly fearing anything that threatened his perfectly curated world. My mother, Lorraine, was gentler, quieter, the kind of woman who folded napkins into roses and believed silence could smooth over anything. She wasn't cruel, not overtly, but her fear of discomfort made her complicit in every wound I carried. She saw things. She always did. The way I dressed, the way I spoke, the way I watched the girls in school the way most people expected me to watch boys. But she never asked questions, only shifted conversations, only looked away. I was 18 when I finally said it out loud. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't come with fanfare. Just a late night in the kitchen, the sound of the dishwasher humming, and my voice, "Dad, Mum, I'm gay." For a moment, time didn't move. My father stood still by the counter. Then, he put down his glass with a quiet, chilling precision. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He simply walked to the hallway, turned the lock on my bedroom door from the outside, and said without turning back, "You will not sleep under this roof tonight." My mother was behind him. Her hand went to her chest, but she said nothing. Not even when he opened the front door and told me to leave. Not even when I stood there, suitcase half-zipped, tears not yet fallen. She watched me from the kitchen window as I walked down the driveway, the porch light still on my life folded into a duffel bag. No words, no embrace, not even a whisper. The only sound was the click of the lock behind me. I slept at a bus station that night. I remember the cold metal bench and the flicker of fluorescent lights. But mostly, I remember the silence, the kind that wraps around your ribs and squeezes. I wasn't just unloved, it was inconvenient. A liability to a man who prized image over intimacy. There was one person who tried to reach me. Eli, my little brother. He was only 11 at the time, all limbs and oversized glasses, too young to fight, but old enough to understand. He slipped me a note the next morning, hidden in my coat pocket. Just 5 words in crooked handwriting, "You don't need to change." I cried reading that. Not because it made everything better, but because it was the only thing that made sense. The only thread that felt real in a house built on silence and staged smiles. Caleb, my older brother, didn't say anything. At dinner, the night before I left, he made a joke about me wearing boots instead of heels. Everyone laughed. He laughed the loudest. In the years to come, that laughter would echo in moments of doubt, in rooms where I second-guessed my worth, in interviews where I downplayed myself, in relationships where I accepted less than I deserved. But back then, all I had was a bag, a bench, and a name I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. Riley Emerson, the girl who loved women, the girl who wasn't wanted. That night, I made a promise to myself, not of revenge, not even of return. Just this I would live, and somehow, someday, I would belong somewhere, not because I lied about who I was, but because I dared to be her, even if it meant walking alone. For the next year, I did just that. Walked, moved, disappeared. I dropped the last name Emerson the first week I arrived in Albuquerque. Just Riley. It felt like enough. I slept in shelters, couch surfed with strangers I met through bulletin boards, and took whatever jobs people didn't ask too many questions about, washing dishes, folding linens in motel basements, wiping counters in diners that smelled like burnt bacon and old grease. I stopped marking time in months and started counting by laundromat tokens. Every morning I woke up not knowing what the day would bring. But every night, I went to bed knowing one thing for sure: I wouldn't go back. I couldn't. Going home would have meant agreeing that I was broken, apologizing for breathing the wrong way, for loving the wrong people. I'd rather starve than shrink. There were days I didn't speak to anyone, days I couldn't get out of bed even when bed meant the back booth of a 24-hour diner that let me linger. I would stare at the Formica table counting the scratches like constellations. There was a kind of pain that made your body heavy, but your mind heavier. Depression wasn't dramatic for me. It was dull, constant, like a wet coat I couldn't take off. And yet, somehow I kept moving. Maybe it was inertia. Maybe it was the voice of Eli in my memory reminding me I didn't need to change. One morning, I wandered into a community centre to use the bathroom and warm up. On the wall, surrounded by curling leaflets for language classes and church potlucks, was a flyer. Red, white, and blue. Military recruitment event. No experience needed, hope, structure, purpose. I didn't feel patriotic. I didn't even feel curious. I felt exhausted. And that flyer looked like the first offer of stability I'd seen in months. So I took one of the tear-off tabs at the bottom. 3 days later, I walked into the recruitment office, wearing borrowed jeans and my only clean shirt. The sergeant barely looked up when I introduced myself. "Riley, what?" he asked, pen in hand. "Just Riley," I said. He squinted at me. "You got ID?" I nodded, "but I'd rather not use it." He paused, then shrugged. "Long as you pass the test and don't get caught lying, I don't care if you go by Wonder Woman." I didn't smile. I didn't joke. I just nodded. Training was hell. I wasn't built for endurance. My body didn't know discipline. I failed my first physical, cried alone in the locker room where no one could hear. But I showed up again, and again, and again, until something in me clicked, not bravado, not toughness, but a quiet understanding that strength wasn't about domination. It was about not breaking. My muscles changed, yes, but more than that, I changed how I saw myself. I wasn't ashamed of my body anymore. It wasn't decoration, it was armor, it was a function, it was mine. Of course, I kept everything else hidden, my queerness, my past. I learned to code switch, fast laughed at the right jokes, nodded at the right lies. I became fluent in camouflage, not just in uniform, but in behaviour. To survive, I had to play a part, but somewhere underneath the silence, I never stopped being Riley. One night, after lights out, I sat in my bunk and wrote a letter. To Eli. Just his name at the top made my throat ache. I told him I missed him. That I still had the note he wrote. That I hoped he still remembered me, not the version our parents painted, but the real me. I told him I was trying. I told him I hadn't quit. I folded the letter, tucked it into the pages of an old notebook, and never mailed it. Maybe I was afraid it would never reach him. Maybe I was more afraid he'd never write back. But the act of writing it made me feel like I hadn't disappeared completely. Like somewhere out there, someone still saw me. That year, I became a ghost with dog tags. But a ghost who could run 5 miles, strip a rifle, and stand her ground. And that was something. Not a destination, but a beginning. Boot camp didn't care who you were before. It didn't ask if you were running from shame or chasing a new name. It just broke you down, muscle by muscle, layer by layer, until all you had left was grit or surrender. I chose grit, but it came at a cost. There were nights I lay in my bunk with my hands clenched tight under the blanket jaw, aching from how hard I held myself together. The air always smelled like metal and sweat, and the walls felt like they could hear your thoughts. We were told to strip away the individual, become the unit. But for someone like me, who had already been stripped of home identity and dignity, that order was both a relief and a trigger. I watched the boys who reminded me of Caleb's swagger, through drills loud and careless, quick to crack jokes that made others wince but laugh anyway. I learned fast that masculinity in the barracks meant dominance, not competence. There was no room for softness, no space for difference. I had already been cast out of that world once, and now I had to wear its mask to survive inside it. But then, there was Ava. She didn't talk much the first few weeks. Had the kind of quiet that drew people to her without knowing why. She ran faster than anyone shot with eerie precision and kept her mouth shut unless it mattered. One day, after a hellish obstacle course, I collapsed beside her in the dirt. "You ever feel like you're hiding in plain sight?" I muttered. She looked at me for a long second and said, "Every day." We didn't say more that afternoon. We didn't have to. From then on, we moved together. Ava never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. She just listened, nodded, and once, when I flinched at a slur muttered under breath by another recruit, she stood a little closer to me. She became my mirror, not because we were the same, but because she saw me even when I didn't want to be seen. I found purpose in patterns. I was good at spotting inconsistencies, at memorizing sequences, at anticipating logistical snags before they happened. While others braced for combat roles, I quietly excelled in operations. My commanding officer noticed, gave me small tasks at first: inventory scheduling, transport coordination. I did them fast, precise, with no need for praise. Rank came quicker than I expected, not because I was loud or charming, but because I made systems work. I learned that power didn't always have to roar. Sometimes it whispered through efficiency and preparation. Sometimes it wore glasses instead of medals. But with every step up, I felt the weight of my silence grow heavier. I lived in constant fear that someone would dig too deep, ask the wrong question, and find the version of me I kept locked away. That one wrong comment in the mess hall, one slip of a glance, could undo everything. I kept my head down, smiled when expected, never lingered in locker rooms, never corrected pronouns when people assumed my dating history. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to tell someone, anyone, that I wasn't ashamed of who I was. Just scared that the truth would cost me the only stability I'd built since being cast out. But I didn't scream. I trained harder. I volunteered for overnight rotations. I perfected my cover story like it was part of the uniform. At night, I'd trace Ava's shadow across the tent flap or bunk wall and wonder if she knew. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but she never treated me differently. And that was a kind of grace I hadn't known before. Boot camp ended. Orders came. We were deployed. As I packed my gear, Ava handed me a folded note. "You're not invisible, Riley," it read. "You're just building the kind of strength most people never have to." And I see it. I didn't cry. I folded the note and placed it beside Eli's deep in the lining of my duffel. 2 truths I carried. 2 people who reminded me that I was still me even when I couldn't say it out loud. War was waiting, but so was something else. A version of myself I hadn't yet met, but was starting to believe could exist. Deployment hit like a desert wind, hot, dry, full of grit and unapologetic. The base was all dust and barbed wire surrounded by a heat that made metal too hot to touch, and tempers flare with the slightest spark. There was no time to think about identity. There was only routine survival and watching each other's backs. I wasn't a hero. I was a logistics officer with a knack for predicting problems before they exploded. But sometimes problems didn't give you the luxury of foresight. They just arrived. Fast, loud, and unforgiving. The convoy that day was routine supply transport, nothing fancy. Ava was in the second vehicle. I was in the first, scanning maps and watching the road like it owed me answers. We were 20 minutes out when it happened, a sudden, sharp sound that cracked the silence. Then smoke. Then screaming. I don't remember running. I only remember reaching, pulling bodies out of the wreckage, shouting orders that felt like instinct, not strategy, bloodied hands, torn sleeves, a soldier crying for their mother. I moved onto muscle memory, not fear. When the dust settled, 3 lives had been saved. No casualties, no medals, just exhaustion. Later, someone called me a hero. I shook my head. No, just present. But word spread. My CO asked if I'd give a statement for internal communications. I declined. I didn't want attention. I didn't want interviews. I wanted quiet. I wanted the names of the people who lived that day, not my own, to echo in that space. That night, I wrote in my journal, the one I kept zipped inside my pillowcase, I don't need to be known. I need to be undeniable. And slowly, I became that. Reliable, steady. The kind of person others turned to, not because I was loud, but because I didn't flinch. Because I showed up. Ava and I were stationed together again months later. Time didn't soften her, but it made her warmer in small ways. A hand resting a second longer on my shoulder, a glance that said more than entire conversations. We didn't speak of love. That word was too loud, too risky, too dangerous. But we knew. There was something there. Something that didn't need names. She once asked during a late-night watch rotation, "Do you think we'll ever get to stop hiding?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her and whispered, "I hope so." It was the most honest prayer I'd said in years. In the field, our unit became a kind of family. Not like the one I left behind, but better in some ways. They didn't know everything about me, but they knew enough to trust me. Loyalty mattered more than lineage. Presence more than pedigree. I was promoted again. A quiet affair, a firm handshake, a patch sewn on my sleeve. No ceremony, no speeches. Just a nod that said, "You've earned this." And still, I didn't call home. Not even when the base got access to satellite phones for a holiday message. Not even when Ava said, "Maybe it's time." I shook my head. They made their silence clear. I'm just returning the favour. She looked like she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Instead, she handed me a small tin box. "For your letters," she said. Inside were the ones I'd written but never sent. To Eli, to myself. She'd kept them safe, even the ones she hadn't read. "So, you don't forget who you are?" I didn't cry. I rarely did anymore. But that night, I pressed my forehead to the box and whispered, "Thank you." Not to her, not even to the box, but to the girl who wouldn't break, who had walked through fire, silence, and exile, and still found her own breath at the end of every sentence. I didn't need applause. I needed air, and I'd learned to breathe again, even in a uniform that didn't fit all of me, even under stars that looked like the ones above my childhood porch, even in a war that wasn't just out there, but still burning inside. Somewhere between enemy lines and midnight patrols, I stopped being invisible. I started being undeniable. And that was enough to keep going. Somewhere between enemy lines and midnight patrols, I stopped being invisible. I started being undeniable, and that was enough to keep going. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I found it slipped between ration memos and terrain updates tucked inside the usual stack of base mail. No return address. Just my name. My full name, Riley Emerson. No rank, no title, just me. My fingers trembled before I opened it. The kind of tremble you feel not in your hands but in your spine. It was a card. Simple. Blue. On the front, a cartoon dog with a balloon. Inside, "Happy birthday. You still don't need to change. Love, E." I sat with that card for hours. My boots still laced my chest too full to breathe right. Eli, my little brother, still writing to me in the only language we ever truly shared, Grace. No address, no way to answer. Just that one quiet voice still reaching across the years like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. That night, I took out the box Ava had given me and laid each letter beside the card. Some were stained from weather or sweat. Some had creases worn soft from being reread in silence. Letters I wrote to Eli on every promotion, every sleepless night, every time I doubted whether I'd made it far enough to justify the pain of leaving. I never sent them. But now, with that little blue card on my lap, I read them out loud to no one. Or maybe to the girl I used to be, the one who had whispered, "Just live." The next day, I found myself at the edge of camp where the dry wind tangled my hair, and the world felt bigger than the orders we followed. I took out a photo, not of the unit, not of Ava, but of my family. A rare one taken the summer before everything cracked. Caleb had an arm thrown around me like he meant it. My mother was laughing at something no one remembered. My father was standing behind us, his hand resting on Eli's shoulder. A frozen portrait of a lie. I studied it and something strange settled into me. I didn't feel anger, not the kind that burns. What I felt was smaller, sadder. I pitied them, not because they didn't love me, but because they were too afraid to. Too afraid of what it might cost them in the eyes of a town, a church, a school board. I realised then that their silence had never been personal. It had been inherited. Later that week, a new recruit arrived, young, nervous eyes darting like a bird in a storm. She reminded me of me. Her name was Jordan, soft-spoken, always at the edge of the group. One night, I found her alone in the comms tent staring too hard at the ground. I didn't ask what was wrong. I just sat beside her. After a long silence, she said, "Sir, can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how personal," I said. She looked up. "Did you ever feel like being here was the only way to matter?" I didn't answer right away. I let the question linger like steam from a mug. Then I said, "I felt like it was the only place I wouldn't be told to disappear." Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. She just nodded. That was the first night she called me by name without flinching. That was the first night I realised I didn't need to say the word gay to make someone feel seen. I just had to show up. Fully. Present. Over the next weeks, Jordan stuck close. Not needy, just near. I taught her how to prep a field radio in under 90 seconds. She taught me that the next generation wasn't looking for perfect mentors, just real ones. I didn't come out in speeches. I didn't hang flags or start movements. But I told her what I wish someone had told me. You're allowed to be more than what they expect. Back in my bunk, I added another letter to the box. This one was different. It wasn't for Eli. It was for me. The Riley who had been 17 and afraid. I wrote, "You don't have to make them proud. You just have to be free." And for the first time, I believed it. Freedom, though, was never weightless. It came with aches you couldn't name and moments that blurred into silence. That silence roared the day the building collapsed. It was supposed to be a simple humanitarian mission, distributing supplies to a local school restructured as a medical post. Nothing about it felt dangerous. Until the second floor buckled. One moment, I was handing a crate to a medic. Next, I was beneath rubble air thick with dust ribs cracking like old branches. Time became elastic. I remember the light dimming and a voice maybe my own, maybe not muttering, "Don't let this be it." Why, I came to in a field hospital with my arm in a sling, 3 ribs wrapped, and my knee braced like scaffolding, holding up a life I hadn't finished building. Ava was sitting beside me. No uniform, just a t-shirt fatigue in her eyes and something softer worry. She didn't speak at first, just watched until my eyes focused. "You're too stubborn to die," she said. I laughed or tried to. It came out as a wheeze. "Don't make me laugh. It hurts." She reached for a paper cup, offered me water, then asked quietly, What's hurting more, the ribs or being forced to stay still? I stayed under care for 3 weeks. Time stretched slow and swollen. Between physical therapy and half-silent meals, I reread old letters. I found myself writing again, not just to Eli, but to Ava, to Jordan, to people who'd never hear the words, but shaped them anyway. I wrote about the fear that didn't come from war, but from recognition, that I could survive a collapse but still hesitate to be seen. One morning, my CO came in with a clipboard, and a tone I'd learned to brace for. "Command's offered you a stateside post," she said. "Training strategy intel. You'd oversee an entire unit. You've earned it." I nodded slowly. "And what's the catch?" She smirked. "Visibility. You'd be more public. Not press tours, but a face, a name." I didn't answer. She left the offer on the tray beside my untouched breakfast. That night, Ava returned. She didn't ask what I'd decided, just sat at the edge of my bed, elbows on knees. After a long silence, she said, "When we first met, you were a ghost." I looked at her. "And now," she said, "you're fire under stone. Most people won't see it until they step too close." I smiled. "That's poetic." "It's true," she said. "And it's time the world saw it too." I turned the offer over in my hands like a stone, waiting to see which edge would cut first. What did visibility mean when you'd built your survival on invisibility, when every step forward meant pulling your past like a shadow behind you? But then I remembered something else Ava had once said about strength, that it wasn't just in what you carried, but in who you carried it for. 2 days later, I signed the acceptance letter. At the bottom, under my name, I scribbled one line before folding it closed. "If I'm going to be watched, let them see strength." Recovery wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. Each step taught me something new about resilience, not the loud cinematic kind, but the kind that limped before it ran, that bled beneath its medals, that stood up anyway. When the transport landed stateside, I wore my uniform like it was skin-scarred, real and earned. As I stepped off the ramp and into the noise of the base, I didn't feel fear. Not that day. I felt a presence. I felt grounded. Leadership didn't come with parades or applause. It came with early mornings, long reports, and the weight of other people's fears settling into your shoulders. But I showed up. I listened. I trained not just soldiers, but future leaders. People like Jordan, who stayed in touch after transfer, who once wrote, "You didn't say much, but you saved me." At night, I'd sit in my office and look at the wall photos of units maps commendations. But in the corner, taped above the desk, was that card from Eli. "You still don't need to change." It reminded me that everything I'd built hadn't erased who I was. It had made room for her. Riley Emerson wasn't just a name. She was a storm survivor, a truth claimed. A girl who once walked away with nothing and returned carrying a legacy stitched into every step. The silence hadn't broken me. It had shaped me. And now I made sure that when others walked into it, they'd find someone waiting, ready to say, "You don't have to disappear to matter, you just have to show up." The text came late on a Sunday night, nearly lost, between admin pings and training updates. It was short. Just, "Dinner? Tomorrow, 7 p.m, Caleb's place. Come if you can. E." I read it 3 times, once with confusion, twice with disbelief. Caleb's place. The diner. A place that once served pancakes and scorn in equal measure. The same tile floors I used to mop as a teenager when my father thought chores would make me less dramatic. I stared at the message until my phone dimmed. Ava, sitting across from me, looked up. "Something wrong?" I shook my head slowly. "My brother, Eli, he wants me to come to dinner at Caleb's diner." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Is that safe?" I offered a half smile. "It won't be dangerous. Just familiar in the worst ways." The next day, I stood outside the diner for 7 full minutes before pushing the door open. The bell jingled. Nothing had changed. Same scuffed counter, same faded menu board, same laminated specials that hadn't been special since 2004. Caleb was behind the counter, leaning with casual arrogance, wearing a button-up with sleeves rolled, and the kind of smirk that said he'd already decided the story he'd tell about me later. Well, look what the cat dragged in. He called arms open like this was a reunion and not a reckoning. I didn't hug him, just nodded. Hey, Caleb. Eli appeared from the back kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and when he saw me, something in his posture melted. He crossed the room in seconds, and for the first time in 2 decades, we embraced. You came, he whispered. You asked, I whispered back. Our parents arrived 5 minutes later. My father's hair was more silver than I remembered, but his eyes had lost none of their cold precision. My mother wore pearls and tension. They didn't hug me. They didn't offer a smile. Riley, my father said, as if he were tasting the name, seeing how it felt in his mouth after all this time. We heard there's going to be a military parade in town tomorrow. I nodded once. There is. My mother chimed in, her voice light and tight like old ribbon. We were invited. VIP seats. Daniel pulled some strings with the city council. Caleb smirked. Only dignitaries and high-ranking officers will be featured, right, real American heroes, and all that. My father raised his glass of iced tea. Exactly. The best of the best. None of them asked why I was home. None of them asked what I did now. I could have spoken up, told them, announced it like a drumline. But something in me held still. Instead, I just smiled politely and said, I hear it's going to be quite the show. Dinner was a study in discomfort. Caleb talked about his business empire as if the diner's broken jukebox counted as an asset. My father shared stories of community boards and school achievements as if he hadn't expelled me from his version of family. My mother asked if I had a friend I was staying with. Yes, I said. Several, in fact. One of them saved my life. No one asked what I meant. Eli kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something, but didn't want to steal whatever piece we'd managed to stitch together. After the dishes were cleared, my father stood. Well, we'll see you tomorrow, he said. We've got the best seats in the house. I met his eyes. I know. They left without ceremony. Caleb gave me a 2-fingered salute and vanished into the kitchen. Eli lingered. Are you okay? I let out a slow breath. I will be. He nodded, then reached into his back pocket and handed me a folded napkin. On it, he'd scribbled something in the handwriting I still recognized. I still remember who you were, it read. But more than that, I see who you are. The next morning, I would stand in front of them all. But that night, in the quiet of a closed diner, I stood in front of myself. Whole, unflinching, and finally ready. I didn't go home. I didn't sleep. Instead, I got in my rental car and drove. Not far. Just through the city I had once called home. The streets looked smaller than I remembered, as if distance had shrunk their arrogance. I passed the high school, its brick face unchanged, the windows dark. I used to sit behind the second-floor window in AP English, counting the cracks in the ceiling, wondering if any of those words about selfhood and symbolism would ever matter to someone like me. I wondered if anyone remembered the girl who got expelled by absence rather than decree. Next, I drove by the church, the one with the white steeple and the judgment that echoed louder than the choir. I remembered sitting in the back pew, my hands folded, my heart hiding. They used to teach us that God forgives everything except when you live outside the blueprint of what a good daughter should be. But still, the hymn that played in my head wasn't anger. It was longing. Longing not to belong, but to be seen. I pulled over at a park I hadn't visited since I was 16. The swings were rusted and the paint on the jungle gym was peeling. I sat on the bench where I once told my first crush I liked her. She didn't respond with cruelty, just confusion and silence. Another early lesson: sometimes rejection isn't loud, it just fades away. Still, not all the memories were bad. There was the bookstore, where I used to read poetry in the aisles, pretending I was browsing when really I was building a language for a self that hadn't been named yet. There was the old theatre marquee still flickering where I saw my first movie alone and didn't feel lonely. I drove slowly, letting the city narrate the years I had missed and the person I had become in their absence. Just past midnight, I stopped in front of Eli's house. The porch light was off, but I knew he was home. I didn't knock. Instead, I took out a small envelope I had carried in my coat pocket all day. Inside, a letter. The kind that took years to write, but only seconds to feel true. On the front, I wrote his name. Just Eli. Inside, it said, "You were always my truth. When the world locked its doors, you handed me a key. When silence became law, you gave me language. Every time I wanted to vanish, your crooked little note reminded me to stay visible. I've done things I never dreamed I could. But the most impossible one was becoming someone who didn't break. And I think that started with you. Love always." I slid it under the door and stood there for a moment, hand resting on the frame. The wind picked up gentle but full of memory. I let it carry away the weight. Back at my motel, I laid my uniform on the bed. Pressed, polished, whole. The medals gleamed under the bedside lamp, but it wasn't the shine that made me pause. It was the way the fabric held shape, as if it knew who I had become inside it, as if it had watched me transform and chose to fit me better with time. I ran my hand over the patches, the rank, the history. I thought of every version of myself who would have never believed this moment could come. The girl on the bench. The recruit was in borrowed jeans. The woman under the rubble. All of her had led to this. My phone buzzed. Ava. Just one message. Make them remember. I stared at those 3 words until they blurred, not with tears, but with certainty. I would. Not for revenge, not for applause, but for the 17-year-old girl who stood outside her own house, with a locked door behind her and a world of uncertainty ahead. She had walked through the shadow. Now she would walk in daylight. I packed carefully, laid out my boots, tied my hair back, and for the first time in decades, I didn't brace myself. I didn't flinch. I didn't wonder if I deserved to be seen. I just prepared, because tomorrow they would see me, all of me, and not because I forced them to, but because I refused to hide. The clock ticked past 2 a.m. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights blink like slow applause. Somewhere out there, my parents were sleeping in a hotel, rehearsing for a parade they didn't know I was commanding. Caleb was probably still telling stories about business deals that only existed in laminated menus. But maybe Eli had read the letter already. Maybe he was sitting with it the way I once sat with his. I didn't pray. I didn't need to. I had already heard. By the people who mattered. By the person I had finally become. When the first light crept over the horizon, I stood straight in my uniform one last time and whispered to the dawn, "Let them see." The applause was a wave slow to start, then growing as if the crowd wasn't sure whether they were clapping for the title, the uniform, or the woman inside it. I kept walking. Each step was measured, rehearsed, but it wasn't about precision anymore. It was about presence. I wasn't marching for spectacle. I was marching to exist in full view in the same town that once tried to erase me in silence. I passed the section with the city officials. They stood, a few of them nudging each other, whispering. Their smiles were rehearsed too. I recognized the mayor who used to teach civics when I was a freshman. He once sent me to detention for refusing to recite a pledge I didn't feel belonged to me. Now he was applauding. I let my gaze drift just enough to the front row. My father had not stood. Not fully. He had started to rise, instinct perhaps, when the announcer declared my rank. But something in him stopped short. His eyes were narrow now, unreadable. Maybe pride and shame were wrestling in him. Maybe just confusion. He hadn't seen this coming, not from the girl he locked out. My mother sat frozen hands, white-knuckled around the strap of her handbag. Her lips were pursed in that tight way she always did when confronted with anything remotely emotional, like her mouth was afraid of leaking softness. She wasn't clapping, not anymore, just watching. I wondered what she saw. A soldier, a stranger. Her daughter, Caleb, leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. His sunglasses were off now, and I could see it, the flicker of discomfort he tried to swallow. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. Maybe to speak my name. Maybe to explain me away. But the moment passed, and he looked down. And Eli, still at the back, still shining like a lighthouse in a storm of pretenders. He didn't cry, not in a dramatic way, but the tears were there tracing down his cheeks quietly, like they had nothing to prove. I met his eyes again, and this time I let myself smile. Not wide, just enough. Behind me, my unit followed in seamless formation. These were the people who knew me, not by my past, but by my steadiness. They didn't care what name I'd been born with, or what door I'd once been shut out of. They only knew I showed up, that I held the line when it mattered. The band reached its crescendo. Flags rippled overhead, caught in the late morning breeze. Somewhere a child shouted, "That's a lady soldier," and someone else murmured, "That's the commander." And still I didn't look away, because this was the reckoning, not the angry kind, not the theatrical takedown. This was the quiet triumph of truth, showing up where denial once sat smug. I came to a slow halt in front of the viewing stand, squared my shoulders, and offered a salute to the dignitaries, to the general beside them. And then, just once, without ceremony, I turned my head. I looked at my father. He stood finally, as if protocol demanded it, as if the authority I carried in that uniform temporarily outweighed whatever resentment he still clung to. His hand hovered unsure. He saluted, not out of love, but out of habit, and I didn't return it. Instead, I turned back to the route and lifted my chin to the next street. Behind me, the silence from the front row spoke louder than any anthem. Ahead of me, the crowd roared as the next division marched through. But for me, the parade had already done what it needed to do. I had been seen, not just by a town, by the girl who once stood outside her house and whispered, "Live." She was watching too, and for the first time she was proud. The final stretch of the parade loomed ahead, flanked by banners that flapped like heavy lungs, exhaling every ounce of ceremony into the humid air. My boots struck asphalt in rhythm, not for show, not for spectacle, but as a declaration I was here, still, whole. We turned the corner onto the last avenue. The crowd thinned, where the road narrowed, funneled toward the command platform that loomed ahead, like a stage for unfinished history. And there, waiting under the shadow of a canopy, marked by 5 stars and stern faces, stood the general. He stepped forward as we approached, his posture precise, his gaze steady. General Whitaker, the man who had once questioned my transfer file, who'd made me prove twice as much to be taken half as seriously. He had never shown me cruelty, just the indifference that most women in command learn to translate into expectation. But now, as I led the unit toward the end of this long road, he didn't hesitate. He brought his hand to his brow in a crisp salute and said firmly, clearly, "Ma'am," not Colonel, not Emerson, not even Commander, just that, "Ma'am." A title loaded with respect, with recognition, and perhaps unintentionally with irony, because no one in my family had ever used it on me, not even when they wanted to pretend we still shared blood that didn't curdle at the difference. Behind him, cameras clicked like distant lightning. I didn't flinch. I simply returned the salute with clean, precision eyes, forward shoulders square. The salute wasn't for me. It was for everything I had carried, every piece of myself I'd once been told to leave behind. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father rise to his feet again, this time not because of ceremony, but because old instincts die hard. Years of discipline and hierarchy ran too deep in his spine to let him sit when a general saluted someone he still struggled to name as his daughter. His hand twitched at his side, half raised, uncertain. My mother's knuckles gripped her purse as if respect might spill out and shame her for it. Caleb blinked too slowly, trying to process a story that didn't end with my failure. But I didn't look at them. I led the final pass without apology, without hesitation, without flinching from the applause or the silence it contrasted. My unit moved behind me like water behind a blade, calm, sharp, unyielding. We reached the dispersal point and I gave the signal. My soldiers peeled off in practice choreography, a living mosaic of grit and grace. As I stepped out of formation, the band began its final number, a softer march, a coda more than a climax. The kind of music that felt like dusk. As the crowds began to murmur, disband and wander, the press gathered like smoke at the edge of the route. A reporter in navy slacks and anxious posture thrust a mic forward. Breathless, Colonel Emerson. "What does this day mean for you, personally?" I paused. Not for effect, for memory. "Then," I said, "it means I made it through." Another question followed, something about recognition legacy. I barely heard it. The words that lingered were from a younger voice. Jordan's voice. "You didn't say much, but you saved me." And then came the question that mattered. What would you say to your family watching? Time slowed for half a second. I could have said nothing. I could have walked away. But instead, I met her gaze and said steady and low, "I hope they saw what survival looks like." The words settled like dust after a march, unmoved by weather, unbothered by interpretation. I didn't clarify. I didn't soften. And for the first time, I didn't wonder if I was too much. One of the camera flashes caught Eli's face just behind the press line. He wasn't crying now. He was standing tall, both hands in his pockets, eyes locked on mine. I nodded once. Not to him. For him. Across the square, I spotted Ava at the edge of the crowd. No uniform today. Just jeans and the shirt I once stole from her bag in the barracks and claimed as mine. She wore it like an inside joke. Our eyes met. She gave the smallest nod. That was enough. I made my way toward the military vehicle waiting near the staging lot. As I climbed in, I looked back one last time. The flags were still up. The podium is empty. But in the middle of it all stood a memory, the 17-year-old girl who had once whispered live and hoped someone someday would listen. She had been heard, and now she was leading. That night the city was quiet in the way only small towns can be, where even the wind feels like it's remembering something. I didn't go out to celebrate, no drinks, no toasts. I didn't need anyone's congratulations. The parade wasn't the destination, it was the closure. But there was still one place left to go. One last thing to do. I changed out of my uniform, folding each piece with the same care I once reserved for letters I never sent. Then I took out the frame. It was wrapped in soft cloth, carried all this way like a secret I was finally ready to place. The photo was simple, grainy from age edges slightly curled. I, at 18, before everything collapsed. Sitting on the back porch, legs crossed awkwardly, Eli was beside me with his glasses slipping down his nose. I was smiling, not big, but real. A moment before exile, before silence, before truth became something too expensive to hold in public. I drove to the old house slowly, as if each block measured a year I had once lost. The porch light was off, just like the night I was pushed into darkness. The siding was faded, the bushes overgrown, but the door was the same. Brown, hollow, still holding echoes. I stood in front of it, not knocking. Not now. I hadn't come for a confrontation. I'd come for completion, a different kind of reckoning. I placed the frame on the porch right beside the mat that still said, "Welcome," with cruel irony. Taped to the back was a single envelope sealed by hand. Inside, my final words, not of apology, but of rebirth. The note read, "You tried to bury me, but I was seed. I took root in places you never looked, in people you never bothered to love. I grew not because of you, but despite you. This picture is the last thing I'll ever give you. Not because I owe you memory, but because he deserves it. Eli deserved a sister who lived. And now she does. Ah." I stepped back, took a long breath, and turned away, without hesitation. No glance over the shoulder, no ache in my spine. Just the soft sound of my boots against the old wood. I didn't need to know if they'd find it. I didn't care if they framed it or threw it away. What mattered was that I had returned not to reclaim space, but to plant a final truth where silence once lived. At the same time, in a small apartment across town, Eli opened another envelope. This one slid under his door with care. He unfolded the letter slowly, eyes already brimming before the first line. It read, "You saved me when no one else did. That will always matter. I used to think I had to become someone new to deserve love. But the truth is, I just had to remember who saw me first. You did. When I was a ghost in our own home, you wrote me back into life. I hope this town treats you better than it treated me. But even if it doesn't know this, you were never like them. You were always more. And that more helped me find myself. Your sister, always." He held the letter for a long time, pressed it to his chest. Not dramatically, just with quiet reverence. Then he reached into his wallet and pulled out the wrinkled note from years ago. "You don't need to change," still tucked behind a faded school ID. The two pieces of paper sat side by side now. A beginning and a continuation. Back at the motel, I packed without urgency. I wasn't escaping. I was releasing. Each item folded was a page turned. Each zipper closed was a sentence finished. The weight wasn't gone, but it was lighter. Ava called just before midnight. Her voice was soft, familiar. "You didn't go to the house alone, did you?" she asked. "I did," I replied, "but I didn't stay. Just left something behind." She paused. "Closure?" "No," I said, "truth. Closure is about them. Truth is for me." She didn't fill the silence, just breathed with me. And that was enough. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing past the windows like a sigh. I watched it move through the street lamps, carrying dust and old ghosts. Somewhere in that breath, I felt the past loosen its grip. Not disappear, but finally step aside. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, letting stillness wrap around me like the opposite of fear. Tomorrow I'll leave this town. Not as someone trying to forget, but as someone who had remembered enough to heal. I had been cast out. Then I had been carved into something strong. Now I was neither an exile nor a hero. I was a woman with roots, a woman who had bloomed. And like anything that blooms in hard soil, I had learned that what survives isn't always what was planted. It's what refuses to stay buried. 2 months later, I stood in front of a room full of uniforms, young, sharp-edged, full of ambition, and the kind of nerves that come before someone tells you how to become. They were cadets at the Youth Military Academy, some barely 18, some already wearing their futures in how straight they stood and how rarely they blinked. I wasn't there to lecture. I was there because someone had finally asked me to speak. Not about tactics, not about war, but about leadership. Real leadership. The kind that survives beyond medals. The auditorium was quiet in that restless way, the air thick with expectation. I cleared my throat, adjusted the mic, and looked out not at ranks, but at people. When I was your age, I began someone told me I didn't belong. Not with words, with silence, with the locks turned on the doors, with eyes that flinched when I spoke my truth. The room didn't shift, but something in the air leaned forward. I've led operations that saved lives. I've stood in rooms where being myself could have cost me my career. But the hardest mission I ever faced was surviving myself. Surviving the version of me I was told not to become. There was no applause. Not yet. That wasn't what this was for. You're here because you want to lead, I said. But leadership isn't about command. It's about clarity. It's about knowing who you are when no one else is looking. When the uniform comes off. When the parade ends. When the silence returns. A few heads nodded. One girl in the second row wiped at her eye with a knuckle, fast pretending it was a scratch. I saw her. I didn't call her out, but I kept going for her. They'll teach you about discipline, tactics, and strength, but they won't always teach you that you can lead without masks, that you can walk into a room and be fully yourself even if that self scares them. My voice didn't rise. It deepened, anchored. The titles they give you don't define you, I said slowly. The steps you take in silence do. Someone inhaled too loudly in the back row. Someone else whispered something, but the room hushed it on instinct. I took one final breath. And to every girl who was told to hide, who was told her difference was shameful or inconvenient or too much, you were never the problem, their fear was. This time the silence broke not into applause, but into something deeper recognition. Some clapped, most didn't, but eyes met mine like mirrors. I didn't wait for questions. I stepped off the stage with my spine tall and my heart steady. Later that evening, I returned to my office. The fluorescent lights buzzed low and the air was still. My desk was tidy, the paperwork aligned, but my gaze went to one thing only. On the far wall beside the coat rack hung two things. First, my uniform jacket pressed clean, bearing the rank I'd once thought I'd never wear. And beside it, framed in simple black, a clipping from the town newspaper. Colonel Emerson. The salute that changed a town. I didn't touch it. I didn't trace the glass. I simply stood there letting the weight of it sit next to me, not on me. Then, slowly, I unbuttoned the jacket, slipped it from my shoulders, hung it beside the frame, because who I was had never needed fabric or title. I turned off the lights, walked out, and carried my truth unhidden into the night. The silence hadn't broken me. It had shaped me. And now I made sure that when others walked into it, they'd find someone waiting ready to say, you don't have to disappear to matter. You just have to show up. And if you're still listening, maybe because you know what it feels like to be unseen, uninvited or unloved, I want you to hear this. You are not alone. Sometimes the world will try to dim your light to keep its comfort. But your existence is not a disruption. It's a declaration. So keep walking, keep breathing, keep becoming. And if my story touched something in you, drop yours in the comments. I read them, I carry them, I remember them. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. Not just for me, but for every story waiting to be heard, including yours. We're building something here. And you belong.